Dawson, put that rifle down. That is not your weapon. She didn't answer. She didn't even blink. The enemy commander had spent 3 weeks building the perfect ambush. He had identified every shooter, every threat, every dangerous man on that team. He had pulled the trigger on the SEAL sniper himself, coldly, precisely, exactly as planned. With Ryan Mitchell down, the Americans had nothing left, except the woman he never once put on his list. The woman carrying their ammunition. 743 meters. Crosswind, under fire, first round, one trigger pull from a person nobody saw, and his entire operation was finished. Subscribe now, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story reaches. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because someone ordered her to be. Not because there was a mandatory formation or a briefing she had to attend. Sergeant Emily Dawson was awake before the sun because that was simply who she was, the kind of person who checked things twice before everyone else checked them once, who finished her work before others started theirs, and who moved through the world so quietly that most people forgot she was there at all. The forward operating base in northern Iraq was never truly silent. There was always a generator humming somewhere, always the distant crackle of a radio, always the sound of boots on gravel as the night watch rotated. Emily had learned to sleep through most of it, but on mornings before a mission, something in her chest kept her eyes open and her mind moving before the alarm ever had a chance to sound. She sat on the edge of her cot in the half-dark and listened to the base breathing around her. Then she got up and went to work. The supply room was empty at that hour, which was exactly how she liked it. She moved through the rows of equipment with a flashlight, her hands checking each item with a familiarity that went beyond training. Ammunition cases, medical pouches, communication gear, rifle cleaning kits. She touched everything, examined everything, cataloged everything with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that in a combat zone. The difference between a good day and a catastrophic one was often something as small as a loose bracket on a rifle scope or a cracked seal on a waterproof bag. Emily Dawson was 29 years old, and she had been assigned to this SEAL support unit for nearly 11 months. Her official designation was Logistics Specialist. Her unofficial title, the one the operators used when they talked about her among themselves, was Runner. Not as a compliment exactly, but not as an insult either. It was simply a description, the way you might describe a tool by its function. She ran ammunition when the team moved. She ran gear when they needed it. She ran in the most literal sense so that the people who mattered could walk. And the people who mattered were the 6 Navy SEAL operators at the center of this unit. They were the kind of men that Emily had grown up hearing about, not in the exaggerated way that movies portrayed them, but in the real quiet way that her father used to describe the men he had trained. Her father had always said that the most dangerous soldiers were never the ones who acted dangerous. The most dangerous soldiers were the ones who were so completely comfortable in their own capability that they had nothing left to prove. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mitchell was exactly that kind of man. I was 34 years old, lean and unhurried with pale green eyes that always seemed to be calculating something even when he was laughing. He had been a Navy SEAL for 9 years and a designated sniper for 6. He had deployments in Afghanistan, Syria, and 3 other places that didn't appear on his official record. He was not the loudest man in the unit. He was not the most physically impressive. But when something complicated needed doing, when the team needed someone to hold a position to see what others couldn't see, to make a decision in a fraction of a second that could save or cost lives, Ryan Mitchell was the person they all looked toward. Emily had been maintaining his rifle for 11 months. She had cleaned it after every mission. She had checked its components after every inspection. She had replaced worn parts before anyone else noticed they needed replacing. She knew that rifle the way a musician knows an instrument, not just its function, but its personality, its tendencies, the way it responded under different conditions. She had never once told Ryan Mitchell any of that. She told him only what was necessary: a scope mount that needed tightening, a stock adjustment that would improve his natural point of aim, technical observations delivered in flat professional language that communicated information without revealing understanding. Because revealing understanding would have required explaining how she came to have it. And Emily Dawson was not ready to explain that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She was working through the final inspection of Ryan's rifle on the morning of the mission when he appeared in the doorway of the supply room. Coffee in hand, still wearing the expression of a man who had accepted an early wake-up call as simply another feature of the landscape. "You're already in here," he said. It wasn't a question. "The optic alignment is off," Emily said without looking up. "Temperature dropped overnight. It will have shifted your zero." Ryan stepped into the room and set his coffee on the nearest surface. He watched her work for a moment. "How much?" "Enough to matter at distance," she said. "I'm correcting it now, but you should verify after I'm done. Confirm your zero before you get into position." He nodded slowly. He was watching her hands. The way she moved the adjustment tool was precise and unhesitant, the kind of movement that came not from reading a manual, but from doing something hundreds of times until the knowledge lived in muscle memory. "You know," he said, "I've worked with a lot of support personnel. Most of them can follow a maintenance checklist." Emily said nothing. "You don't use the checklist." She set the tool down and looked up at him for the first time. "The checklist tells you what to look for. It doesn't tell you what to find." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and smiled, not the easy performative smile of someone trying to be friendly, but the smaller, more genuine expression of someone who had just been surprised. "You notice everything, don't you?" he said. Emily held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to deliver a simple answer. "It's my job." She went back to the rifle. Ryan stayed in the doorway a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the main briefing area, and Emily let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. She placed her hand flat on the rifle for just a moment, the kind of gesture that would have looked like nothing to anyone watching, but that Emily herself would have recognized as a word she couldn't say out loud. Then she set the rifle aside and went to prepare the rest of the equipment. The briefing began at 0600. Emily sat at the back of the room, which was where support personnel were expected to sit. The 6 SEAL operators clustered at the front, along with their team leader and the intelligence officer who had been assigned to the operation. There were maps and photographs displayed on a portable screen. There was a lot of technical language spoken in the flat, efficient shorthand of people who had done this many times before. Emily listened to all of it. She listened the way she always listened, with complete attention and no visible reaction, because she had learned long ago that the people who were expected to carry things were rarely asked whether they understood things, and she had stopped waiting to be asked. The mission appeared straightforward. The team was to move into a mountainous valley approximately 14 kilometers from the base, locate a suspected weapons cache that was supplying enemy forces operating in the region, document the cache and extract without contact. Standard reconnaissance. She had supported 17 similar operations in the past 11 months, but something about this one made her sit very still. She couldn't name it precisely. It was something in the intelligence officer's voice, a slight hesitation before certain words, the way his eyes moved when he was pointing at the map, as if he were drawing attention away from something rather than toward it. Emily had noticed this same quality in her father once when she was 13 years old, and he was describing a training exercise to her. She had asked him afterward why he sounded different than usual, and he had said very quietly, "Because sometimes what we know is incomplete and we have to decide whether to say so." She did not say anything. She was support personnel. She carried the ammunition. The team moved out at 0730. Emily carried 60 pounds of supplies, ammunition, spare parts, backup communication equipment in a pack that was not the heaviest she had ever carried, but was heavier than most people at the base would have believed was possible for someone of her size. She had never complained about the weight. She had never asked for it to be reduced. She simply adjusted to it the way she had always adjusted to things that were difficult, not by changing the difficulty, but by becoming equal to it. The route into the valley took 4 hours. Emily walked at the rear of the team, which was standard protocol for support personnel. She watched the terrain, kept her pace steady, and said almost nothing. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes, who served as the team's medic and was the person on the unit most likely to talk to her, fell back beside her twice during the march. The first time he said, "You good?" She said, "Yes." The second time he said, "You're quiet." She said, "I'm always quiet." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Ryan said you fixed his scope this morning," Dominic told her. "The alignment was off." "He said you explained it like you'd done it 100 times. Emily kept her eyes on the terrain ahead. "It's a basic adjustment." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "My sister's a mechanic. She can describe an engine problem in a way that makes it sound simple. But there's a difference between people who know something because they read it and people who know something because they've lived it. Emily didn't respond. I'm just saying, Dominic said and fell back into his position. They reached the observation point above the valley at 11:40. Ryan moved into a sniper position, a natural depression in the rock formation that gave him a clear line of sight across the valley and up into the opposing ridgeline. Emily set up the supply cache 20 meters behind him in a position that was protected from direct fire, but accessible quickly if the team needed resupply. The operators spread into their positions, and then they waited. Emily had learned patience from her father. She had learned it the way she had learned most things from him, not through lecture, but through example. Thomas Dawson had been capable of holding a position without movement or sound for hours at a time. And from the time she was 12 years old, he had brought her along on training sessions where patience was as fundamental a skill as marksmanship. Your mind will lie to you, he had told her once. When she was 14 and had shifted position after 2 hours of stillness because something in her leg had begun to cramp. It will tell you that nothing is happening, so there's nothing to lose by moving. But the moment you move is the moment the world changes. Be still until you know. Don't move until you're certain. She had moved that day and he had said nothing, and the silence had been the sharpest correction she had ever received. She did not move now. She sat with her back against the rock wall, legs folded, hands resting on her knees, and she waited with the supplies and the spare ammunition and the quiet that had become as natural to her as breathing. At 12:23, the radio crackled. One of the operators reported movement in the valley below. At 2:27, a second operator confirmed it. Not the weapons cache they had been sent to document, but a significant enemy presence. At least a dozen armed fighters moving through the lower valley in a pattern that suggested they had been tipped off about the American position. The team leader's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled. "We have a problem," Emily heard Ryan's response. "I see them, they're staging. This isn't random movement. We need to confirm the count before we extract. Give me 3 minutes." What happened in the next 3 minutes was the thing that Emily would replay in her mind for years afterward, not with horror exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes to people who have been present at a moment that changed everything. The enemy had positioned a sniper of their own, not in the valley, on the ridgeline, and he had been watching the American team for longer than anyone had realized. The shot came without warning. A single crack of sound, not the ambient noise of the valley, not the distant report of something far away, but the immediate, unmistakable sound of a precision rifle round fired at close range, and in the same instant, Ryan Mitchell went down. Emily was moving before she had consciously decided to move. She was on her feet, crossing the 20 meters to Ryan's position in a dead sprint, because in that single moment, every rule about where support personnel were supposed to be dissolved in the face of a more immediate reality. Someone she had been entrusted to support was down, and she had supplies, and she was closest. She reached him in seconds. I was face down in the rock depression. She rolled him over with both hands, checking his neck, his pulse. He was breathing. The round had caught him in the upper left shoulder, a hit that had knocked him unconscious, but had not, as far as she could tell in those first chaotic seconds, struck anything immediately fatal. "Medic up," she shouted, which was a call she had heard dozens of times and had always heard from a distance, never from her own throat. Then the second wave of fire hit. Multiple positions opened up simultaneously. Not the random chaos of fighters shooting in panic, but the coordinated, disciplined fire of people who had planned this engagement. The enemy had been waiting. They had taken Ryan because Ryan was the threat they could not afford to leave standing. And with Ryan down, with the SEAL team's sniper gone, they were moving. One of the operators, Petty Officer, Second Class, Jake Carver, scrambled into a firing position 20 meters to Emily's left and began returning fire. Another operator, whose name she only knew as Torres, was shouting coordinates into his radio. Dominic was moving toward Ryan's position from the other side, his medical kit already open. And from somewhere above them on the ridgeline, the enemy sniper was adjusting, getting ready to fire again. Emily could hear it in the pauses. She had grown up listening to her father explain the rhythm of a sniper's work, the way silence before a shot had a different quality than ordinary silence. There was intention in it, a gathering of all available stillness before a single violent expulsion. She heard that silence now. She looked at Ryan Mitchell's rifle lying in the rock depression where it had fallen when he went down. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she heard her father's voice with the same clarity she had heard it when he was alive, standing behind her on the range. When she was 16 years old, his hand on her shoulder. The wind moving across the hillside above the family property in Montana. A rifle is never just a weapon, Thomas Dawson had told her. It is a set of decisions that you make before you ever pull the trigger. Who you are, what you believe, what you're willing to answer for. She had spent 9 years trying to be someone who didn't have to answer for those things. 9 years of carrying other people's ammunition. 9 years of standing behind the people who mattered. 9 years of making herself invisible so completely that she had almost convinced herself she was. And now there was a man bleeding in a rock depression beside her, and a team of 6 operators pinned down and losing ground, and a sniper on a ridgeline who was about to fire again. She had never wanted this. She had worked extraordinarily hard not to be in this position. But the position had found her anyway, because there are some things that don't care how carefully you've tried to avoid them. There are some things that simply wait with the same patience her father had taught her, the same willingness to hold still until the moment is right, and then they arrive. And when they arrive, the only question that matters is who you actually are. Emily picked up the rifle. Behind her, she heard Dominic shout something. She heard Jake Carver yell her name. She heard Torres' voice cut off in the middle of a sentence because everyone who was close enough to see what was happening had suddenly stopped making sound. Because the ammo runner had just picked up the sniper rifle. And she was moving, not with hesitation, not with the careful, uncertain movements of someone attempting something beyond their capability. She was moving with the precise, unhurried economy of someone who had done this before. She found the position Ryan had been using, and she improved it. In 6 seconds, she adjusted the tripod, confirmed the sight picture, and oriented herself to the ridgeline above them. Jake Carver's voice came from her left, raw and disbelieving. "Dawson, what are you doing?" Dawson put that down. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The wind was blowing from the northwest at approximately 12 to 15 miles per hour, shifting slightly toward the east. The temperature was lower than it had been in the morning, which Ryan's scope had already been corrected for. The ridgeline above them was approximately 680 to 750 meters, depending on the exact position, and she was working with an elevation that put her at a natural disadvantage for the upward angle. She had shot in worse conditions. She had shot in conditions her father had specifically constructed to be worse so that when she encountered difficulty in the field, she would already know what it felt like. She found the ridgeline through the scope. Her breathing slowed. The shouting around her receded, not because it stopped, but because her mind moved into the particular state of attention that her father had spent years teaching her to reach, a place where the noise of the world was still present, but no longer distracting, like rain on a roof you've learned to sleep through. She tracked the ridgeline left to right, and then she found him. I was 743 meters away, tucked into a natural crevice in the rock face with good concealment and an excellent angle of fire into the American position. He was experienced. She could see it in the discipline of his position, the way he had chosen ground that gave him shade and sight both. He had taken the first shot with precision and was now adjusting for a second target. He was adjusting toward Torres. Emily held her breath for the last fraction of a second, corrected for wind, corrected for elevation, and fired. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley and came back in an echo that sounded to the operators around her. Almost unreal because none of them had expected it, and because the precision with which it had been placed was not the precision of someone making their best attempt at an unfamiliar skill. It was the precision of a professional. The enemy sniper on the ridgeline did not fire again. For a moment, the whole valley was almost still. Then someone, she thought it was Torres, but she couldn't be certain, said something in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Did she just... Emily was already tracking back to the ridgeline, because the sniper was down, but the sniper had not been alone, and there were still men in the valley below, and the team was still pinned, and she was not finished. "Positions," she said, and her voice was calm, and it was steady, and it was the voice of someone who had never, not once, lost the ability to do this, only the willingness. "Give me positions," she said again, and this time Torres answered, his voice tight but professional. Because in the middle of a firefight, the human mind defaults to the person who sounds most like they know what they are doing. 2 shooters in the lower rock formation, 9 o'clock. "I see them." Elevated position on the far left ridgeline, distance unknown. I'll find it. And she did, one by one with a patience that her father would have recognized and a precision that he had spent 15 years building into her hands and her mind. Emily Dawson dismantled the enemy's ability to hold that valley. Not every shot was a kill, but every shot mattered. She suppressed the elevated position long enough for Carver to break left and close the distance to the lower formation. She eliminated the coordinated fire that had been holding Torres pinned behind a rock outcrop. She bought Dominic the 30 seconds he needed to stabilize Ryan's wound without taking fire from above. She did this for 12 minutes. 12 minutes in which the woman who had spent 11 months carrying other people's equipment became, without announcement or explanation or any particular fuss, the most important person in that valley. When it was over, when the fire had stopped, and the enemy positions had been broken and the team had begun the process of consolidating and preparing for extraction, Jake Carver crawled to her position and lay flat on his back in the dirt beside her and stared at the sky for a very long time without saying anything. Then he turned his head and looked at her. "Who the hell are you?" he said. Emily was still looking through the scope, scanning the ridgeline one final time, with the patience she had always had and the thoroughness that her father had made a condition of completion. She lowered the rifle. She looked at Jake Carver, and for the first time in 11 months, she gave someone on this team an answer that was not filtered through the careful distance she had constructed around herself. "My name is Emily Dawson," she said. "My father was Master Sergeant Thomas Dawson, Marine Corps. He taught precision marksmanship for 22 years. Jake stared at her. "He taught me from the time I was 10 years old," she said. "I stopped competing when he died. I joined the military as support because I wasn't ready to use what he gave me." There was a silence between them that felt very full. "Wasn't ready," Jake said slowly. She looked at him. "What changed?" Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were running out of time." Jake stared at her for another long moment. Then he put his head back down against the dirt and laughed, not the bright, surprised laugh of someone who found something funny, but the low, exhausted, deeply relieved laugh of someone who had been very close to dying and was now processing the fact that they weren't. 12 months, he said half to himself. 12 months I've been handing this woman my rifle to clean and asking her if the magazines are loaded. Emily didn't answer that, but somewhere beneath the careful surface she had spent 9 years maintaining, something that had been held very tightly, began for the first time in a long time to loosen. She sat with the rifle across her knees and the wind coming in from the northwest, and the sound of her team organizing themselves back into order around her. And she thought about her father and what he had believed she was capable of, and all the years she had spent proving him right without ever once letting anyone see it. He had always told her that the rifle didn't define her. Her choices did. She had spent 9 years making choices that kept her hidden. Today she had made a different one. Not because she was ready, not because she had decided in some clear and comfortable moment that the time had finally come, but because the time had arrived anyway with no interest in whether she was ready, and she had been left with only 2 choices. Be who she had trained herself to be, or watch people die to protect a secret that wasn't worth protecting. When you put it that way, she thought it wasn't really a choice at all. And perhaps that was exactly what her father had been trying to tell her. That the moment of truth was never going to wait for her to be comfortable. It was simply going to arrive. And when it did, everything she had buried, everything she had carried quietly in the years since she lost him, was going to rise up exactly when it was needed. Like a rifle that had been maintained perfectly. Like a zero that had been checked before the mission. Like a woman who had been ready for years, and simply waiting for the world to need her. The extraction took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of controlled movement back through terrain that had looked manageable on the way in and felt entirely different on the way out. When Ryan Mitchell was unconscious on a field litter and every person on the team was running on the specific kind of adrenaline that comes after a firefight. Not the sharp, clarifying surge of the fight itself, but the slower, heavier chemical that floods in afterward when the shooting stops and the body starts calculating what it just survived. Emily carried her pack the entire way back. Nobody offered to take it from her, not because nobody noticed, but because somewhere in the 40 minutes since she had set down Ryan's rifle and stood up from that rock depression, the people around her had undergone a quiet, almost involuntary recalibration. The kind that happens when you realize the person you thought you understood is someone you have never understood at all. Jake Carver walked 3 meters behind her the entire route back to the base. He didn't say anything. He just watched her move, and every few minutes she could feel his eyes on her back with a specific quality of attention that was different from the way anyone on this team had ever looked at her before. Torres walked point. Dominic stayed with Ryan on the litter. And the team moved, and nobody said much of anything. And the silence had a texture to it that Emily recognized from the few times in her life when the world had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. They reached the forward operating base at 6:19 hours. The moment they passed the gate, everything that had been held together by the discipline of the field began to come apart at the seams. The base medical team was waiting. Ryan was taken immediately. Dominic went with him, talking fast and steady, giving the medical staff everything they needed to know about the wound, the blood loss, the timeline. He was professional and precise, and Emily watched him disappear through the door of the medical building and thought that this was what her father had always said: separated real soldiers from everything else. The ability to stay competent in the middle of chaos, to do the technical work that needed doing even when everything inside you was screaming. Then the gate guard looked at the team and looked at Emily and said, "Is everyone accounted for?" Jake Carver said. Not everyone came back the same. The guard looked confused. Jake didn't explain. The debrief began 45 minutes later. Emily sat in the same chair she always sat in, the one near the back, slightly separated from the operators, because that was where support personnel sat. But when the intelligence officer opened his notes and looked up at the room, his eyes went to her and stayed there with the expression of a man who had already received a preliminary report and was not entirely certain he believed it. The unit commander was there, Colonel David Reese. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his early 50s who had spent 30 years in special operations and had the particular quality of stillness that came from having seen nearly everything and having learned to sit with the weight of it. He sat at the end of the table, and he said nothing when Emily entered from the room, and he said nothing when she took her usual seat near the back. But his eyes moved to her once, and she felt the weight of that glance like a hand on her shoulder. Torres was the first to speak. He gave the operational account, the route, the timing, the enemy contact, the ambush. He was methodical and accurate, and he did not embellish. He described the loss of the Overwatch position when Ryan went down. He described the suppressing fire from the enemy positions. He described the period during which the team had been effectively pinned. Then he paused, and Colonel Reese said, "How did the Overwatch position get recovered?" Torres looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. Sergeant Dawson picked up Chief Mitchell's rifle and engaged the enemy sniper, he said. 743 meters, first round. The intelligence officer stopped writing. Colonel Reese looked at Emily. Emily looked back at him. "Sergeant Dawson," he said, "is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." "First round?" "Yes, sir." I was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of disbelief, she thought, but the silence of a man who was doing several calculations simultaneously and not yet ready to stop. "What was your correction?" he asked. And this was the moment she had known it was coming, not since she picked up the rifle, but since long before that. Since the day she joined this unit and started maintaining equipment and carrying ammunition and telling herself that invisibility was a kind of service. She had always known, in the place where you know things you'd rather not know, that this conversation would eventually happen, that there would be a room and a question and a man waiting for an answer that she couldn't give without explaining everything. Wind was northwest, 12 to 15, shifting east, she said. Temperature correction was already set from the morning adjustment. Elevation angle required a positive click and a half. I held slightly left of center mass to account for the shift. Every person in that room was absolutely still. "Where did you learn to calculate that?" Colonel Reese asked. Emily took a breath. "My father," she said. "Master Sergeant Thomas Dawson, Marine Corps retired, precision marksmanship instructor for 22 years. The name landed in the room with the weight of something heavy being set down. She watched the colonel's eyes change. Not dramatically. He was not a man who made dramatic expressions. But something shifted in the precise, quiet way that things shift when a large piece of information arrives and begins reorganizing everything around it. "Tom Dawson's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." Colonel Reese sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for 1 second. Then he looked back at her. "I trained with your father," he said, "Quantico, 2001. He was the best natural instructor I ever encountered. He paused. He used to talk about his daughter. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. He said she could read mind the way other people read words, the colonel said. He said she was better than anyone he had ever taught. Another pause, including himself. The room was very quiet. You've been here 11 months, Colonel Reese said. Yes, sir. Carrying ammunition. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long time. Why, he said. And Emily Dawson, who had spent 9 years answering only what was necessary and nothing more, found that this particular question had no efficient answer. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was the kind of honest that she had not been willing to be with anyone for a very long time. Because I wasn't ready to be what he made me, she said. The colonel nodded slowly. And now, he said. She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. And then she said, I don't think I got to choose. Colonel Reese looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked around the table at his operators at Torres, at Jake Carver, at the others who had come back from that valley and were now sitting in this room and who had all in their own way been changed by what they had seen in the last several hours. We'll discuss everything else in the morning, he said. Everyone is dismissed. People began to move. Chairs scraped. The intelligence officer closed his notebook. And as everyone filtered out into the hallway, Colonel Reese's voice came once more, directed at Emily's back. Sergeant Dawson, she stopped. Your father would be very proud, he said. She didn't turn around. She just nodded once and walked out and made it exactly 12 steps down the hallway before she had to stop and press her back against the wall and close her eyes and breathe. She did not cry. She almost did, but she held it in the way she had learned to hold difficult things, not by refusing to feel them, but by giving them a space that was not here, not now, not in front of people who were already trying to figure out who she was. There would be time for that later. Maybe. She pushed off the wall and kept walking. The next 72 hours were the strangest of Emily Dawson's military career. Not because anything dramatic happened. In fact, it was almost the opposite. The hours immediately following the debrief were marked by a particular quality of suspension, as if everyone in the unit was waiting for something to arrive and was trying to go about their business in the meantime. Emily went back to the supply room, because that was where she worked, and because her work did not stop being necessary, because everything else had become more complicated, and because there was something clarifying about standing in a room surrounded by equipment and doing the things that needed doing with her hands. She was cataloging the ammunition that had been expended during the mission, cross-referencing the field report, with the actual count, making notes about what needed to be requisitioned when she heard the door. She turned. Jake Carver was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been to the edge of something and come back, and who was still 24 hours later, not entirely sure what to make of what he'd seen. He held out one of the cups. Emily looked at it. You drink coffee, he said. I've seen you. She took the cup. He stepped into the supply room and leaned against the shelf across from her and looked at the floor and then looked at her and then looked at the floor again. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who was naturally comfortable with words. He was comfortable with action, with precision, with the physical language of trained soldiers. Conversation required something different. I owe you an apology, he said. Emily held her cup and waited. 11 months, he said. 11 months I've been here. And in that time I never once, he stopped, started again. I called you runner. Everyone did, she said. That's not an excuse. She looked at him steadily. No, she agreed. It's not. Jake absorbed that without flinching, which told her something about him that carrying his ammunition for 11 months had not. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know that I'm asking because I'm genuinely trying to understand, not because I think you owe me an explanation. She waited. Why didn't you say anything, he said. Not about your father necessarily. Just any of it. You knew things. You could see things. Every time you handed me my kit before a mission, you knew more about that equipment than I did. Why did you stand at the back? Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ammunition case in her hands and then set it on the shelf carefully. My father died in a training accident, she said. He was demonstrating a technique to a group of junior instructors. Something went wrong. The official report said it was an equipment failure. She paused. It wasn't. Jake waited. It was a judgment error, she said. His. He pushed beyond the limit of a situation because he trusted his own capability to carry him through it, and he was wrong by a fraction, and that fraction cost him his life. She picked up her coffee. He was the best I ever saw, and he died because he was so certain of what he could do that he stopped accounting for what could go wrong. The supply room was very quiet. I spent the year after he died asking myself whether his confidence had killed him, she said, and I couldn't find an answer I was comfortable with. So I decided to be the opposite of him. I decided to be the person who stays behind the shooters, who carries the ammunition, who makes sure everyone else's equipment works without ever needing to prove what I could do. Jake said nothing for a moment. Then, but you proved it anyway. I didn't have a choice, she said. You did, he said. You absolutely had a choice. You could have stayed behind cover. Nobody would have blamed you. You could have... Ryan would have died, she said. Torres would have died. Maybe all of you. Maybe, Jake said. But you couldn't have known that for certain. Emily looked at him. I knew it well enough, she said. He was quiet again. Your father, he said finally, would he be surprised that you did what you did out there? She thought about this carefully. She gave it the same attention she gave to everything, the full weight of honest consideration, no corners cut. No, she said. He wouldn't be surprised. He always said that training tells the truth about a person when the moment arrives. That you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your preparation. She paused. He prepared me well. Jake held his coffee with both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who was reconstructing something. Rise to the occasion, he said. I've heard that 100 times. It's wrong, Emily said simply. People don't rise to the occasion. They fall to what they know. The occasion just decides how far down that is. Jake stared at her. Your father said that. He said it constantly, she said. Every time I thought a drill was unnecessary or a correction was too minor to matter. He said the moment doesn't care whether you're ready. It only cares what you know. Jake set his coffee cup down on the shelf beside him and crossed his arms and looked at the floor. And Emily could see in the set of his shoulders the particular posture of a man rearranging his understanding of something he thought he had figured out. That day on the range, she continued, and she wasn't sure why she was telling him this, except that something about the supply room and the quiet and the coffee had created a small contained space where honesty seemed manageable. The last day my father and I trained together before he died, he had me shoot a steel target at 815 meters in a 20-mile crosswind. I'd done it before in better conditions. I made the shot on the third attempt. She paused. He said, now, tell me what you did wrong. Jake looked up. I'd made the shot, she said. I told him I didn't do anything wrong. He said you made 3 attempts. You should have made 1. She looked at her hands. We spent another 4 hours on that range. And I didn't go home until I understood why the first 2 attempts were wrong, not just why the third one was right. She was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks later, he was dead, she said. Jake didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. She had heard sorry so many times in the first year after her father died that the word had lost most of its texture, become smooth and frictionless. Something that moved through the conversation without catching on anything. What Jake said instead was, and after that, you decided to carry the ammunition. After that, I decided I didn't want the weight of it, she said. The weight of knowing what I could do and having to decide when and whether to do it. I thought if I stayed behind people, if I supported instead of led, if I made myself small enough, then I wouldn't have to make the kind of decisions my father made, the ones that cost him. Jake was looking at her very steadily. But you made them anyway, he said. Yes, she said. Yesterday on that ridge. Yes. And they didn't cost you. She looked at him. No, she said. They didn't. He picked up his coffee again. He was thinking she could see, turning something over and over in his mind with the same care he probably gave to every problem that mattered. I think, he said slowly, that the difference between yesterday and your father's accident wasn't capability. You're right that you didn't rise to the occasion. You fell to what you knew, and what you knew was exactly what the moment needed. He paused. But I also think you've been carrying a story for 9 years about why you weren't allowed to use your talent, and I wonder if that story was ever really about your father's confidence, or whether it was just about your fear of becoming too important to someone. The supply room was very quiet. Emily looked at Jake Carver for a long time. She did not tell him he was wrong, because he wasn't, and they both understood that. and there was something almost unbearable about being seen clearly by a man who had called you runner for 11 months. She picked up her ammunition catalog. I need to finish this count, she said. Jake nodded. He straightened up, picked up his coffee, and moved toward the door. He stopped in the doorway and turned back, and his expression had that rare quality that people sometimes carry in the hours after they've been through something together, something that was not quite friendship yet, but was the thing that comes before it. For what it's worth, he said. I'm glad you were there. She looked at the clipboard in her hands. So am I, she said, and meant it. Ryan Mitchell regained consciousness on the second day. Emily heard about it from Dominic, who appeared at the supply room door in the late afternoon, with the tight, relieved expression of a medic who had been watching someone's numbers stabilize for 36 hours and had finally allowed himself to believe it was going to be okay. He's asking for you, Dominic said. Emily looked up from her work. He's been awake for about 2 hours, Dominic said. They told him what happened out there, the full account. He paused. He's been asking for you since about the 20-minute mark. She set her work down. The medical building had the specific quality of all military medical facilities, a controlled antiseptic efficiency that communicated without any particular warmth that the people here knew what they were doing. Ryan was in a recovery bay at the far end, elevated slightly. His left arm immobilized, his color, still not what it should be, but better than it had been when she last saw him crumpled in a rock depression on a ridge in northern Iraq. He looked at her when she walked in. Not the way he had looked at her before, with the easy, slightly distracted attention of a man regarding the support person who maintained his equipment. He looked at her with the complete, undivided attention of someone who had been given information and was trying to reconcile it with 11 months of accumulated assumptions. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. She sat in the chair beside the bed. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but that had edges. I'm told, Ryan said, that while I was unconscious, you picked up my rifle and engaged the sniper who shot me, along with several additional targets, over a period of approximately 12 minutes. That's accurate, Emily said. At ranges up to 743 meters. The far target was closer, she said. The others varied. Ryan looked at her. 12 minutes, he said, give or take. And in 11 months, Dawson, you never said a word. She held his gaze. It wasn't relevant, she said. Not relevant, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger, but was close to the texture of it. The particular discomfort of a person who is realizing they have misunderstood something for a very long time. I handed you my rifle every week. I watched you take it apart and put it back together. I've asked your opinion about adjustments. I've listened to you tell me what was wrong and what needed fixing. And he stopped. He looked at the ceiling. You knew, he said, the whole time. Yes, she said, you knew the rifle better than I did. You're a very good shooter, but she said, that's not. He stopped again, took a breath. That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. She did know it. My father trained me from the time I was 10, she said. I competed through high school. I was ranked nationally at 17. After he died, I stopped. I joined as support because I wasn't, she paused, because I needed time, and support was a way to be useful without having to be what he trained me to be. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Tom Dawson, he said. She looked at him. Colonel Reese told me, he said, this morning. He came by and sat with me for a while and we talked, and he told me who your father was. He shook his head slightly. Emily, Tom Dawson's daughter, has been carrying my ammunition for 11 months. She didn't know what to say to that. How was legendary, Ryan said. I mean in marksmanship circles. I trained under one of his former students. We used to reference his techniques the way you'd reference a textbook. He paused. And his daughter has been running ammo, she said. Running ammo, he repeated. The silence that followed had a different texture now. Not the tension of a misunderstanding being unpacked, but the quieter, more complicated atmosphere of two people sitting with the reality of what had happened and what it meant. Does it bother you, Ryan said eventually, that I didn't see it? She considered this honestly. No, she said. I worked very hard to make sure nobody did. That's not actually reassuring, he said. She almost smiled. I know, she said. Ryan shifted slightly against the pillow and winced at the movement, and Emily watched him absorb the reminder of his wound with the patience of someone who had been injured before and understood that bodies did not heal on convenient schedules. I keep thinking about that morning, he said, in the supply room. You told me the optic alignment was off. It was, she said. You said the temperature change would affect the zero. It would have. And then you said, what was it? He was quiet for a moment, reaching for the exact words. It's my job, he said. Emily said nothing. That's what you always say, Ryan said. Anytime I notice that you've done something that goes beyond the basic requirement of the role, you say, it's my job. He looked at her. But it wasn't, was it? None of it was strictly your job. It was more than that. You were doing more than that every single day. She was quiet. I was doing what I could do, she said finally, within the space I'd given myself. Ryan looked at her for a long time. Well, he said, the space you've given yourself is about to get significantly larger. She tilted her head slightly. Colonel Reese is reviewing your record, Ryan said. All of it, your father's file, your training history, your competition, records, everything. He's already been on the phone with command. He paused. They're going to want to talk to you about a formal designation change. Emily went still. They've been looking at your file, Ryan continued, and apparently what they found is that you qualified expert in basics, scored off the charts in every marksmanship assessment, and your supervisor notes consistently describe you as, and I'm quoting here, demonstrating an unusual level of technical knowledge for the role. He looked at her. Unusual level of technical knowledge for the role, he repeated slowly. I may have understated some things on my assessments, she said. Ryan stared at her. You sandbagged, he said. She didn't confirm or deny it. Emily, he said, and it was the first time in 11 months he had used her first name. You deliberately scored below your capability on military marksmanship assessments. I qualified expert, she said. That's accurate. But you held back. She was quiet for a moment. I told you, she said, I needed a space where I could be useful without having to be who you are, Ryan said. The words landed in the room and sat there. She didn't argue with them because they were true, and she was very tired of the particular kind of energy that pretending required. My father's confidence got him killed, she said, and I spent 9 years being afraid that his confidence had come to me like an inheritance, and that one day I would be in a situation where I trusted my capability past the edge of what was safe, and it would cost me or cost someone else. She looked at her hands. I thought the way to prevent that was to not be the person who had to make those decisions. Ryan looked at her steadily. But that's not what happened out there, he said. No, she said. What happened out there was the opposite, he said. You made the decision to shoot because not shooting was going to get people killed. You didn't push past a limit. You operated exactly within one. He paused. The confidence that killed your father wasn't what you used yesterday. Yesterday you used judgment. Emily looked at him. Judgment, she said. There's a difference, Ryan said. Confidence says I can do this. Judgment says I need to do this, and I know I can. And those two things together are what makes the decision right. He held her gaze. Your father's accident was confidence without sufficient judgment. What you did on that ridge was judgment that happened to require confidence. They're not the same thing. The room was very quiet. Emily Dawson sat in a chair beside the bed of the man whose life she had saved, and she listened to the difference between two words. She had spent 9 years conflating, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not dramatically, not like something breaking or opening, but the small cellular kind of shift that happens when a belief you've carried for years begins to lose its grip, not all at once, but one finger at a time. I've been afraid of the wrong thing, she said quietly. Probably, Ryan said. She looked at him. Your father didn't die because he was good, Ryan said. He died because of a specific decision in a specific situation. That's not a lesson about capability. It's a lesson about one moment. He paused. And you've been paying for that moment for 9 years, hiding something. He spent 20 years building into you because you were afraid that having it was the same thing as misusing it. Emily was silent for a long time. Outside the medical building, she could hear the bass going about its business generators. Footsteps, the distant murmur of radio traffic. The ordinary sounds of a place where people worked and trained and prepared for the next thing. The sounds that had been the backdrop of her entire deployment in all the months she had stood behind the operators and maintained their equipment and called herself a runner. I have a question, she said. Go ahead, Ryan said. If you had known, she said, from the beginning, if you had known who I was and what I could do, would you have treated me differently? Ryan was quiet for a moment. She could see him being honest with himself about it. Yes, he said. She nodded. Would that have been better? She said. He was quiet again. I don't know, he said. Maybe not. She nodded again slowly. My father used to say, she said, that the most important thing about a tool is not what it can do. It's knowing when the moment calls for it. She looked at the window. Maybe 11 months of being invisible was what I needed to understand that. Ryan looked at her for a long time. Somiantum. Maybe, he said. He shifted again, and this time he didn't wince. He looked at the ceiling and then back at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there when she came in. Not just the gratitude of a man whose life had been saved, but the quieter, more complicated expression of someone who was recalibrating, not just his understanding of another person, but his understanding of what understanding even meant. You know what the strangest part of all of this is, he said. She waited. For 11 months, he said, I thought you were protecting my equipment. She looked at him. But you were protecting us, he said, from the very beginning. Every scope you adjusted, every cracked part you replaced before it failed in the field, every warning you gave about conditions and alignment in zero. You were never just maintaining equipment. He paused. You were keeping us alive in ways we never even knew to count. Emily said nothing. But something in the careful arrangement of her expression changed in the small way that things change in people who have been carrying something for a very long time and are only now beginning to consider the possibility of setting it down. She stood up from the chair. I should let you rest, she said. Emily, Ryan said. She stopped. Thank you, he said. Not for yesterday, for all of it. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once. And she walked out of the medical building and back into the ordinary noise of the base, and she stood in the afternoon light for a moment with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the horizon, and she thought about a range in Montana and a man who had stood behind her every morning for 15 years and built something into her hands and her mind that she had spent 9 years pretending wasn't there. She thought about what he had given her. She thought about what she had done with it. And for the first time since the day she watched his coffin go into the ground, Emily Dawson allowed herself to consider the possibility that carrying the weight of who he made her was not a burden. It was the whole point. Colonel David Reese did not sleep well that night. He had gone back to his quarters at 2100 hours with a personnel file under his arm, a file that had been sitting in the unit's administrative system for 11 months without anyone looking at it closely enough to understand what it contained. He sat at his desk with a cup of coffee that went cold beside him, and he read every page twice. And the more he read, the stiller he became, with the particular stillness of a man who is assembling a picture that should have been visible a long time ago and is only now coming into focus. Emily Dawson's official record was clean and unremarkable on the surface. She had entered the military at 21. She had trained in logistics and support operations. She had qualified expert in basic marksmanship, a fact that appeared in her file the way many facts appeared in personnel records present, but unexamined, a data point floating without context. Her performance evaluations were consistently positive, but written in the language of someone who did not fully see the person they were evaluating. Words like reliable, dedicated, meticulous. Words that described a good soldier without describing this specific soldier. Nobody had looked deeper. Nobody had pulled the competition records that Colonel Reese pulled at midnight, sitting at his desk with the cold coffee beside him, scrolling through a national database of precision shooting competitions from years prior. And nobody had seen the name Emily Dawson appear consistently in the top 3 placements across 7 different competitions between the ages of 15 and 19. Nobody had connected that name to the logistics specialist quietly maintaining rifles in the supply room. Nobody had thought to look because she was the ammo runner, and ammo runners were not the kind of people you looked at twice. At about 6:30 the next morning, Colonel Reese called Emily into his office. She arrived exactly on time, which he had expected, in the same way he had expected she would stand rather than sit when she entered, and that she would wait for him to speak before she said anything. He was learning to read her now with the particular attention he should have been giving her for months. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He set her file on the desk between them and put his hand flat on top of it. I want to tell you what I found, he said. All right, as she said. 7 national level placements before the age of 20, he said, and the last one the year before your father died. You finished second overall at the Inter-Service Precision Shooting Championship qualifier. You were 18 years old. Emily was very still. Second, he said, to a 26-year-old Marine Staff Sergeant with 6 years of competitive experience. She said nothing. The judge's notes from that competition describe your wine reading as, and I'm quoting directly, among the most intuitive in the junior category in the last decade. He looked up from the file. A decade sergeant. She looked at the desk. And then your father died, he said, and you dropped out of competition. You waited 2 years. You enlisted. You requested logistics and support. He paused. And on your intake marksmanship assessment, you scored expert, which is excellent, but you scored expert at the minimum threshold. Barely expert. Emily looked up at him. I qualified within the required standard, she said. You absolutely did, Colonel Reese said. And you did so based on what I watched you do on that ridge with roughly 40% of your actual capability. The office was very quiet. Do you know what the military calls someone who deliberately underperforms on a capability assessment? He said. She said nothing. We call it a problem, he said, not harshly, but plainly. Not because we want to punish you for it, but because every unit you have served in has made decisions about how to deploy you based on information you gave them that was deliberately incomplete. Emily held his gaze. And people could have been in danger because of that, he said. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, but the expression of a person who has already had this argument with themselves, who has sat in the dark with this specific weight and knows every edge of it. I know, she said quietly. Do you? He said. Ian. Yes, she said. I've known it since yesterday, since I watched Torres almost get hit from the elevated position and thought if Ryan had gone down 3 minutes later, if the angle had been different, if the cover had been worse. She stopped. I know what it could have cost. I've been sitting with that for 2 days. Colonel Reese looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to justify it, he said. I'm asking you to understand that it's done. That chapter of your service is finished. And what happens next is going to require something different from you. Emily straightened slightly in her chair. What happens next, she said. The colonel opened the file again and turned it toward her. There was a document on top, a formal request form partially completed with his signature at the bottom. I'm recommending you for redesignation, he said. Designated marksman qualification. The formal assessment process will require you to perform at full capability, no sandbagging, no minimum thresholds, full demonstration of what you can actually do. He paused. After that, there's a broader conversation to be had about your role going forward. Emily looked at the document. She looked at it the way she had looked at Ryan's rifle on the ridge, not with hesitation, but with the awareness that picking it up meant something that could not be undone. There will be people who have questions, the colonel said, about how you slipped through, about how nobody caught this for 11 months. Some of those questions are going to be directed at your supervisors, at the administrative process, at the assessment system. He paused. And some of them are going to be directed at you. I understand, she said. You'll need to answer them honestly. I will. He studied her for a moment. Why now, he said. Why are you willing now when you weren't before? She looked at the document on his desk. Because Ryan told me something, she said. He said there's a difference between confidence and judgment. Confidence says I can, judgment says I need to, and I know I can, and those two things together make the decision right. She paused. I've been afraid of confidence for 9 years because I thought it was what killed my father. But what I used on that ridge wasn't confidence, it was judgment. And I think, she stopped, took a breath. I think my father had that too. I think I just wasn't able to see it until now. Colonel Reese was quiet for a long moment. Tom Dawson had extraordinary judgment, he said. The accident was an aberration, one decision in a career of thousands of right ones. His voice was careful and honest. I know you know that, but knowing something and believing it are not always the same thing. No, she said, they're not. He picked up a pen and slid it across the desk toward her. The redesignation request requires your signature confirming consent for the assessment, he said. Emily picked up the pen. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she signed. Word moved through the unit the way word always moved through small, enclosed communities, not through official announcement, but through the organic spread of people talking, information passing from person to person, and changing slightly with each transmission until what reached the last person was a general shape of the truth, with some of the specific details softened or sharpened by the telling. What most of the unit knew by the end of the third day was this: the logistics specialist, who had been supporting the SEAL team for 11 months, was Master Sergeant Thomas Dawson's daughter. She had been a nationally ranked shooter before she enlisted. She had shot a 743-meter first-round kill in a crosswind while under fire to save the team, and she was being redesignated. The reactions were varied. Most of the support personnel she worked alongside were stunned into a kind of reverent silence. Specialist Marcus Webb, who had worked in the supply room beside her for 4 months, came to find her the morning after the news spread and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking at her like she was a person he had never actually met. "I used to complain about how long you took with the rifle cleaning," he said. "I know," Emily said, "because I thought you were being unnecessarily thorough." "I was being appropriately thorough," she said. He stood there for a moment longer. "That's really all I came to say," he said. "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Emily said. "You had the information I gave you. You drew a reasonable conclusion. You shot a guy at 743 meters in a crosswind. That's a separate data point," she said. Marcus stared at her for another moment, then nodded twice as if confirming something to himself and left. The SEAL operators were different. They processed things the way trained soldiers process unexpected information, by integrating it, by thinking about what it meant for the mission, for the team, for the way they had been operating. Torres came to find her on the afternoon of the third day and stood beside her at the supply shelf and helped her stack ammunition cases without being asked. And for 15 minutes, they worked side by side in comfortable silence before he spoke. "I've been thinking about your adjustments," he said. She looked at him. "Every time you handed me my kit before a mission," he said, "you always checked the sight picture on my primary, always. I thought you were following a checklist." "I was checking your zero," she said. "I know that now," he said. "But what I'm saying is you corrected it twice in the last 4 months. I remember you telling me the adjustments, and I remember thinking it was minor and not paying much attention. And now I'm trying to remember those missions and figure out whether those corrections made a difference." Emily kept stacking cases. "Kabul Ridge," she said, October 14th. "Your optic had drifted right from a hard landing the week before. I corrected it the morning of the mission. You engaged at 400 meters. She paused. "At that distance, the drift would have put your round outside the target grouping." Torres went very still. "Second time," she said, "December 2nd. Humidity had swollen your stock adjustment. I reset it before you left. It wouldn't have affected your shot necessarily, but it would have affected your fatigue over a 4-hour operation, and tired shoulders affect follow-through on precision shots." Torres was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between astonishment and something else, something that looked almost like the complicated feeling you get when you realize someone has been doing you a kindness for a long time that you never acknowledged because you never knew it was happening. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because it was handled," she said simply. "But why you needed your equipment to work," she said. "When it worked, that's what mattered." Torres set down the case he was holding and turned to face her fully. "No," he said, "that's not what mattered. What mattered is that a member of this team was doing more than her role required in ways that directly affected our safety, and nobody knew about it, and she never once—" He stopped. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the shelf for a moment. "She never once let us thank her for it." Emily looked at him steadily. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said. "I know that," he said. "That's what makes it worse." She almost smiled. "Torres," she said, "you came back from every mission. Every single one. That was enough." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the ammunition case and went back to stacking. And nothing more needed to be said. The formal designation assessment was scheduled for 6 days after the mission. In the 48 hours before it, something happened that nobody on the base expected. It started with a phone call to Colonel Reese from a lieutenant colonel at JSOC Joint Special Operations Command who had seen the preliminary after-action report and had a number of questions. Then there was a second call from a different number asking for Emily's personnel file to be transmitted to a reviewing board. Then a third call, this one apparently concerning the broader implications of the incident for how support personnel were screened and assessed. Emily heard about none of this directly. She heard about it the way she heard about most things, not because anyone told her, but because she was quiet and observant, and people forgot she was listening. She was in the hallway outside the command office when she heard Colonel Reese's voice through the partially open door, measured and steady, talking to someone on the phone. "The question you're asking me," he said, "is whether Sergeant Dawson's performance on the ridge indicates a gap in our assessment process. My answer is yes, but not the gap you think." A pause. "The gap is not that we failed to identify a high-capability shooter," he said. "The gap is that we created a system where a high-capability soldier believed the only way to serve was to hide what she could do. That's a cultural problem, not an assessment problem." Another pause. "No," he said, "I'm not minimizing the administrative failure. The administrative failure is real and I'm owning it. But if we fix the paperwork and don't ask the harder question about why someone with her background and her training and her record didn't feel like she could show up as herself, then we've missed the actual lesson." Emily stood in the hallway and listened and felt the particular sensation of hearing someone articulate something you had not yet found the words for yourself. She moved away from the door before she could hear more. She went back to the supply room, and she sat down on the stool beside the shelf and put her hands on her knees and looked at the wall and thought about what the colonel had said. A cultural problem, not an assessment problem. She had never thought about it that way. She had thought about it as a personal failure, her specific fear, her specific grief, her specific choice to make herself small. She had not thought about the fact that the system had made room for her smallness, that nobody had pushed back, that nobody had noticed or asked or looked more carefully, that the structure itself had allowed her to disappear. Which meant, and this was the thought that arrived quietly and sat down heavily, that she was probably not the only one. She was still sitting with that thought when the door to the supply room opened and someone she did not expect walked in. Sergeant First Class Linda Okafor. Linda was the senior logistics coordinator for the unit, Emily's direct supervisor for the past 11 months, a 12-year Army veteran who ran the support side of the unit with the kind of unflappable competence that meant nobody ever worried about whether supplies would be where they needed to be. She was 41 years old, tall, and deliberate in her movements, and she had the specific quality of authority that came not from rank, but from the absolute certainty of someone who knew their job completely. Emily had always respected her. She had not always been sure whether Linda respected her back. Linda closed the door and stood with her arms folded and looked at Emily with an expression that was complicated enough that Emily didn't try to read it. "I owe you something," Linda said. Emily waited. "I've been your supervisor for 11 months, Linda said. "I wrote your evaluations. I reviewed your work orders. I tracked your requisitions." She paused. "And I never once looked at your intake file, not once." "That's not unusual," Emily said. "Most supervisors don't." "I know it's not unusual," Linda said. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. I followed the standard practice, which is to evaluate the person in front of me based on what they're doing, not what they came with. And the standard practice failed you." Emily looked at her. "It also endangered my team," Linda said plainly. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't picked up that rifle, those men might not have come home." Emily said nothing. "I'm not saying that to make you feel responsible," Linda said. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand that the decision you made 11 months ago to be less than you were had consequences that extended beyond your own career trajectory. And I'm telling you that as your supervisor, I should have caught that. I should have pushed harder to understand who you actually were." The supply room was very quiet. "I made it easy not to," Emily said. "You did," Linda said. "But that doesn't excuse me," she unfolded her arms. "I'm going to be asked to submit a written account of your performance during this deployment as part of the redesignation process. And I'm going to write the most accurate account I can." She paused. "Which means I'm going to write about everything I failed to see." Emily looked at her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I do," Linda said, "because the colonel is right. This isn't just about you. This is about a system that lets people hide, and the people who run that system have an obligation to be honest about how it happened." She looked at Emily steadily, including me. Emily thought about saying something reassuring, about telling Linda that it was fine that she was the one who had made the choice to hide, that the responsibility was hers. She had that sentence ready, had carried a version of it for years. She set it down. "Thank you," she said instead. Linda nodded once. Then she said something that Emily did not expect. "My oldest daughter wants to enlist," she said. Her voice had shifted slightly, still steady, but with a different quality beneath it. She's 20. She wants to go combat support. And she stopped, pressed her lips together. I've been telling her to think carefully about what role she chooses, to think about what she'll be able to handle. Emily looked at her. Because I was worried, Linda said, that she would end up somewhere difficult, somewhere where people didn't take her seriously, where she'd be carrying an ammunition when she should be doing something else. She paused. I told her to be realistic. The weight of that word sat in the room. Realistic, Emily said. Yes, Linda said, and I look at you and I think. She stopped again. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I think I've been telling my daughter to make herself smaller before anyone else has the chance to do it for her. Emily was very still. I think, she said carefully, that you might want to have a different conversation with her. Linda looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, she said, I think so too. She opened the door and paused with her hand on the frame. The assessment is in 48 hours, she said. You should rest. I'll sleep when I'm satisfied the inventory is correct, Emily said. Linda looked at her, and for the first time in 11 months she smiled, not the professional, transactional expression of a supervisor, acknowledging adequate work, but the genuine, unguarded smile of someone who has just understood something she should have understood a long time ago. Tom Dawson's daughter, she said softly. Yes, Emily said. He'd be proud, she said. I know, Emily said, and meant it for the first time without the shadow of grief, pulling at the edges of the words. The assessment day arrived the way important days always arrive, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by being the day after the day before. Emily woke at 04:30. She lay in the dark for exactly 60 seconds, which was a habit her father had given her. He called it the 60-second inventory. Lie still, feel where you are, check your body, check your mind, know what you're bringing into the day before the day has a chance to tell you what to bring. She was bringing 743 meters of proof that single thing he taught her. She was bringing 9 years of grief that was finally beginning to organize itself into something she could carry rather than something that carried her. She was bringing a signature on a document that was the most honest thing she had done in almost a decade. She got up. She dressed in the dark. She went to the range early enough that nobody else was there, early enough that the light was still gray, and the air had the particular quality of quiet that preceded military activity in the way that a held breath precedes a word. She stood at the firing line and looked down the range without a rifle in her hands. She thought about her father, not the man who died, not the accident, not the training ground in North Carolina, not the phone call that had rearranged her entire world on a Tuesday morning in November. She thought about the man who had stood behind her on a different range 20 years earlier, with his hand on her shoulder and the patience of a man who understood that some lessons could not be rushed. She thought about what he had built into her, and she thought about the 9 years she had spent pretending he hadn't. 8:07, the assessment team arrived. 2 officers from the designated marksman program, a range safety officer and Colonel Reese, who had requested to observe. He stood to the side and said nothing to her when she checked in, just nodded once with the expression of a man who had already decided what he believed and was here to see it confirmed. Jake Carver was there. I was not supposed to be. He was not part of the assessment process, but he was standing at the far edge of the range with his arms folded and his jaw set in the look of a man who had decided that being present was the right thing to do, even if nobody had invited him. And when Emily saw him, she felt something warm and uncomplicated move through her chest. Torres was there too, and Dominic, standing at the edge of the range, in the gray morning light, not making a production of it, just being present, because they had decided somewhere in the 48 hours since the news had spread that this was the kind of moment you showed up for. Emily looked at them for a moment, then she looked at the range. Then she stepped up to the line and she accepted the rifle from the range officer, and she did what Thomas Dawson had spent 15 years teaching her to do. She was methodical. She was unhurried. She was honest fully, completely, without reduction or reservation about every single thing she could do. The first stage was a standard distance engagement. 200 meters prone 5-round standard target. Emily put all 5 rounds in a grouping that the assessment officer measured twice before writing the number down, because the first time he thought he'd made an error, he hadn't. The second stage was an extended distance engagement. 500 meters positional supported. Emily made her adjustments without being asked to explain them because the adjustments were not the test, the shots were the test, and the shots landed exactly where she put them. The third stage was the stress stage. After 2 minutes of physical exertion designed to elevate heart rate, a cold barrel, a wind that had picked up to 12 miles per hour with an inconsistent gust pattern, a target at 680 meters. Emily came off the exertion, assumed her position, controlled her breathing, with the particular discipline of someone who had been taught to bring her heart rate down, not by waiting for it to fall, but by actively managing it the way her father had taught her when she was 13 years old on a hillside in Montana. She fired, and she heard from the edge of the range a sound that she did not expect and that she would not forget. Jake Carver exhaled, a single long breath like a man releasing something he had been holding since the valley. She did not look at him. She kept her eye on the scope and cycled for the next round. But she felt it. The final stage was the one the assessment officers always saved for last, because it was the one that separated the people who could shoot from the people who could shoot under the complete layered pressure of an environment designed to make everything harder. Moving target, variable distance, time constraint, simulated communication noise through the headset that required her to filter and maintain focus simultaneously. Emily sat up, and in the moment before she began, she heard her father's voice not as in memory, not as imagination, but as the deeply embedded instruction of someone who had spoken to her often enough, and clearly enough that his words had become part of the architecture of how she thought. A professional, he had told her once, is not someone who never feels pressure. A professional is someone who has practiced being under pressure so many times that the pressure becomes familiar. And familiar things are manageable things. She breathed, she managed it. When the assessment ended, 40 minutes later, Colonel Reese walked to the firing line and stood beside the senior assessment officer, who was looking at his clipboard with the expression of someone who has just encountered data that requires him to update his reference points. Well, the colonel said. The assessment officer looked up. She's not expert, he said. The range went very quiet. She's exceptional, he said. There's a difference. Colonel Reese looked at Emily. She was standing at the line with the rifle grounded and her eyes on the target downrange, and her expression was calm, not the careful, constructed calm of someone managing their reaction, but the natural, settled quiet of someone who has just done the thing they were born to do and is not surprised by how it felt. Sergeant Dawson, Colonel Reese said. She turned. Welcome back, he said. And behind him at the edge of the range, Jake Carver unfolded his arms and Torres said something under his breath that nobody could quite hear. And Dominic put his hand over his mouth for a moment and then lowered it, and the gray morning light shifted as the sun finally cleared the ridgeline and fell across the range, and Emily Dawson stood in it with a rifle in her hands and her father's name in her chest, and 9 years of quiet, patient, invisible labor finally visible in the light. She had not risen to this occasion. She had fallen to the level of everything Thomas Dawson had built into her. And it turned out that level was exactly high enough to reach the sky. The assessment results were official by 1400 hours. Colonel Reese submitted the redesignation paperwork before the afternoon briefing, which meant that by the time the unit gathered for the day's end routine, Sergeant Emily Dawson was no longer officially classified as a logistics specialist. She was a designated marksman. The paperwork said so. The assessment records said so. The score sheets that the senior assessment officer had signed with the particular, careful deliberateness of someone putting his name on something he wanted to get exactly right, those said so too. What the paperwork did not say, and what no official document would ever fully capture, was what it cost her to get there. Not the assessment. The assessment was the easy part, or not easy exactly, but straightforward, in the way that things are straightforward when you have spent 15 years preparing for them, even while pretending you weren't. The hard part was what came after. The hard part was being visible. She found that out on the first afternoon. She was in the supply room still because the supply room's inventory didn't reorganize itself simply because her designation had changed and because she had made commitments about the ammunition count that she intended to keep regardless of what her personnel file now said when 3 people came to find her in the space of 2 hours. The first was a young specialist named Aaron Tully, 22 years old, 8 months into his first deployment, who knocked on the supply room door and stood in the frame with the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they wanted to say and was now uncertain whether to deliver it. I heard what happened out there, he said. Emily kept working. Most people have. I mean, I heard the whole thing, the whole account. Torres told Reyes, Reyes told Webb, Webb told me. He paused. 743 meters, first round, under fire. She looked up at him. Is there something you need, specialist? She said. Not unkindly, but directly. He swallowed. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know I'm not trying to be disrespectful. She set her clipboard down. I've been here 8 months, he said, and for 8 months I don't know how to put this. I've been trying to figure out what I'm doing here, what my role actually is, whether what I'm doing matters. He stopped. And I keep getting told that support matters, that logistics matters, that the people behind the operators are just as important. But nobody actually, he was struggling with it. Emily waited. Nobody ever made me feel like it was true, he finished. Like it was actually true, and not just something people say to make support personnel feel better about not being operators. The supply room was very quiet. And then I heard about you, he said, and I didn't know whether to feel I don't know. Inspired or like the whole time you were here, you were only pretending to be one of us. Like you were slumming it, like logistics was beneath you. Emily looked at him for a long time. She chose her words carefully. I wasn't pretending, she said. Every box I carried was real. Every inventory count I ran was real. Every scope I adjusted, and every cracked part I replaced, and every ammunition case I lugged through 14 kilometers of mountain terrain, all of it was real, and all of it mattered, and I never once thought I was too good for it. She paused. What I was doing was hiding. There's a difference. Hiding inside legitimate work is still hiding, but it doesn't make the work less legitimate. Tully was watching her carefully. The fact that I could do something else, she said, didn't make what I was doing worthless. It made it incomplete. She looked at him steadily. Your work is not incomplete. You are doing the thing you have been trained to do, and you are doing it well, and that is not a lesser thing than being an operator. It is a different thing, and the difference matters. He was quiet for a moment. But you wish you'd been doing this all along, he said. The designation, the shooting, the real thing. Emily considered this honestly. I wish I hadn't been afraid, she said. That's different from wishing I'd never carried a box of ammunition. Tully nodded slowly. He looked like someone who had come in with a question and was leaving with something more complicated than an answer, but more useful. Thank you, Sergeant, he said. She picked up her clipboard. Close the door on your way out, she said. He did. The second person was Marcus Webb, who appeared 40 minutes later, with the specific energy of someone who had decided to do something and was moving before he could talk himself out of it. He set a rifle cleaning kit on the shelf beside Emily's workstation and said without preamble, "Teach me." Emily looked at the kit. "Teach you what specifically?" she said. "Whatever you know," he said. "About maintenance, about reading a weapon, about," he gestured vaguely at the kit, "about doing it the way you do it instead of the way the manual says." She looked at him. "The manual is not wrong," she said. "I know the manual," he said. "I want to know what you know." Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the cleaning kit on the shelf. She thought about her father, who had never once handed her a manual, without first making her understand what the manual was trying to preserve, the knowledge of someone who had already figured out the hard way what worked and what didn't. "All right," she said. Marcus blinked. "Really," he said. "You asked," she said. "Pull that rifle apart and tell me what you're looking for." He pulled the rifle apart. He told her what he was looking for. She corrected him on 4 things in the first 5 minutes, and each correction was specific and grounded in a reason that he could hold on to. And she watched the quality of his attention shift from that of a person performing a task to that of a person actually learning something. And she recognized the shift because it was the same one she had felt the first time her father had moved beyond instruction and into understanding. They worked for 40 minutes. When they were done, Marcus put the rifle back together and looked at it. "I've been cleaning this wrong for 2 years," he said. "You've been cleaning it adequately," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Adequately versus correctly," he said. "Adequately keeps it functional," she said. "Correctly makes it reliable when it matters most." Marcus was quiet. "Is that your father talking?" he said. She hadn't expected that question. "Yes," she said after a moment. "He sounds like someone worth listening to," Marcus said. She said. "He is." She paused, surprised by her own correction. The things he said don't stop being true because he's gone. Marcus nodded and picked up the cleaning kit and headed for the door, and Emily turned back to her inventory and the supply room settled back into its ordinary quiet, and she sat in it and let the correction she'd just made to herself sit in her chest for a while. Aya's present tense, because the things he built in her were still there, still working, still speaking in her hands and her mind. Every time she picked up a rifle or adjusted a scope or stood at a firing line and felt the world go quiet, he was still there. She just hadn't been letting him be. The third person who came that afternoon was the one she least expected. At 16:45, she heard a knock not on the supply room door, but on the frame because the door was already open. She turned. Ryan Mitchell was standing in the doorway. I was out of the medical building. His left arm was in a sling, his color was still not fully back, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body was reminding him with every step that it had recently been through something serious. But he was standing, he was dressed, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not the easy confidence of the man who had handed her his rifle every week to clean, but something more direct, more honest, the expression of someone who had spent 4 days in a medical bay with a lot of time to think. You should be resting, Emily said. I've been horizontal for 4 days, he said. If I lie down again, I'm going to lose my mind. She looked at him. 5 more minutes, she said. I'm fine. You're pale and your shoulder is 2 days behind where it should be in terms of stabilization, she said. 5 more minutes won't compromise your recovery. 12 hours of walking around the base will. Ryan stared at her. How do you know where my shoulder is in terms of stabilization, he said. I talked to Dominic this morning, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You checked on me, he said. She went back to her clipboard. I check on all the equipment I'm responsible for, she said. Ryan was silent for long enough that she looked up. He was looking at her with that new expression, the honest one, and there was something almost amused in it, not the easy amusement of a man deflecting with humor, but the deeper kind that comes when someone does something that is exactly consistent with who they are and you recognize it for the first time. That's the most Emily Dawson thing you have ever said to me, he said. She didn't answer that. He came into the supply room and leaned against the shelf across from her, the same spot Jake had used 3 days earlier, which was apparently where people positioned themselves when they came to have difficult conversations in the supply room. And he was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet because she could tell he was working towards something. I got a call this morning, he said. She looked up. From my commanding officer at the parent unit, he said. Back stateside, he'd seen the preliminary after-action report. He paused. He wanted to discuss the sniper engagement during the Valley ambush. Emily waited. Specifically, Ryan said, he wanted to know how a logistics specialist had executed a first-round precision kill at 743 meters in a crosswind under fire with no formal designation on record. She kept her expression neutral. What did you tell him? She said. I told him the truth, Ryan said, that she was the daughter of Master Sergeant Thomas Dawson and that she had been trained from the age of 10 by one of the finest precision marksmanship instructors the Marine Corps ever produced, and that she had spent 11 months maintaining my rifle, and I had never once thought to ask her who she was. Emily looked at the shelf. He asked me, Ryan said, whether I thought the incident reflected a failure of the assessment and placement process. What did you say? I said yes, Ryan said, but I also said it reflected a failure of leadership at the team level, my failure specifically, because I was her direct mission supervisor, and I treated her as a function, not a person, and I never looked past the role to the individual. He paused. He didn't push back on that. Emily was quiet. Ryan, she said. Emily, he said, you didn't know, she said. I worked very hard to make sure you didn't know. That's true, he said, and it doesn't fully excuse me. She looked at him. You're doing what I did for 9 years, she said. He tilted his head. Carrying something that belongs to the situation and calling it personal failure, she said. The system allowed me to hide. You operated within the information the system gave you. Both things are true simultaneously, and making it exclusively about your failure is as inaccurate as me making it exclusively about mine. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. When did you get good at this? He said. At what? At saying the thing that's actually true instead of the thing that feels right. She thought about that. I've been thinking a lot about the difference, she said. He nodded slowly, then he said, there's something else. His tone shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that she registered it the way you register a change in wind direction before you can see what it means. My CO wants to speak with you directly, he said, not about the redesignation. That's handled at this level. He wants to speak with you about something else. Emily set her clipboard down fully. He's been in contact with the Precision Marksmanship Training Program at Quantico, Ryan said. The program your father ran for 11 years. Apparently, the current program director is a former student of your father's, a colonel named Hargrove. She knew that name. She had heard it once at her father's funeral from a man with silver hair and a rigid posture who had gripped her hand and said, your father changed the way I see a rifle. He changed the way I see a lot of things. Colonel Hargrove, she said carefully. He's been trying to rebuild a specific component of the program, Ryan said. Advanced wind reading, long-range environmental assessment, the elements of precision shooting that are hardest to teach because they're the most intuitive, the things that live in experienced hands rather than textbooks. He paused. He's been looking for the right instructor for 2 years. Emily went very still. My CO showed him your assessment scores from this morning, Ryan said. The supply room was absolutely silent. He didn't just look at the scores, Ryan said. He looked at the methodology notes the assessment officer wrote. The way you made your corrections, the sequence of your adjustments, the manner in which you managed the stress fire stage. He paused. He said, and I'm quoting, because I want to get this right, he said it read like Tom Dawson had written it. Emily turned away. She faced the shelf. Her hand found the edge of it and gripped it, not dramatically, not with the visible shaking of someone losing control, but with the quiet, necessary steadiness of someone who needs something solid to hold while something very large moves through them. Ryan did not say anything. He gave her the time because he had learned in 4 days of medical bay thinking to give her the time she needed for things to land. She breathed. She thought about her father. She thought about a range in Quantico that she had visited once at 16 when her father took her for a week in the summer and let her watch him teach. She remembered sitting in the back of the classroom while he stood at the front and spoke about wind, about the way you read it, not just with instruments, but with your body, your skin, the hair on your arms, the way sound moves differently depending on air density and temperature. She remembered the way the students listened to him, the particular quality of attention that his students always had, not the polite checked-out attention of people waiting for information to stop, but the leaning forward, every word counts attention of people who understood they were in the presence of something rare. She had wanted to be one of them that summer. She had sat in the back of that classroom and wanted it with the clear, sharp want of a teenager who has just understood what she is made for. And then he had died, and she had buried that want so deep that she had almost convinced herself it had never existed. Almost. She turned back around. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. What is he asking? She said. I wanted to meet with you, Ryan said. In person, at Quantico, when your deployment ends. He paused. He wants to talk about the program, about the specific component he's trying to rebuild. Another pause. About whether you'd be willing to come back to teach what your father taught. The weight of that sentence was enormous. She felt it settle over her the way her pack always settled over her at the start of a long movement. Heavy, yes, but familiar in its weight and hers to carry. He said one more thing, Ryan said. She looked at him. He said your father always intended it, Ryan said quietly. That his long-term plan, the one he'd been building toward for years, the reason he documented everything so carefully, the reason he was so precise about recording his methodology, was that Emily would come back eventually and take over the program. He paused. He told Hargrove, before he died, he said eventually she'll be ready, and when she is, you'll know, because she'll show up and the students will lean forward the same way they do when I'm teaching. Emily closed her eyes just for a moment, just long enough to hear that. Then she opened them. He planned it, she said. He planned it, Ryan said. He always planned things in advance, she said. He used to say that preparation is just respect for the future. That if you care about what happens, you make decisions about it before it arrives. Ryan was quiet. He prepared me, she said slowly. Not just by training me, by building the plan around me, by making sure that when I was finally ready, there would be a place for me to go. Ryan nodded. He trusted you to get there, he said, even when you didn't. The afternoon light was shifting. Emily stood in it and felt the full complicated weight of what her father had done, not just in the years of teaching, not just in the patience and the corrections and the early mornings on the range, but in this, in keeping a door open for her that she hadn't even known existed and trusting not just in her capability, but in her eventual willingness to claim it. He had loved her in the most practical, forward-facing way she could imagine. He had believed in who she was going to become, even when she was refusing to become it. She picked up her clipboard, not because she was dismissing what Ryan had just told her, but because she needed to do something with her hands while she held it. "I'll meet with Colonel Hargrove," she said. Ryan exhaled. "Yeah," he said, "I thought you'd say that." "Not because of what my father planned," she said, "because it's the right decision." "I know," he said. "They're different things," she said. "I know," he said again, and smiled the small, genuine smile of a man who had spent 4 days in a medical bay learning to pay better attention. He pushed off the shelf. "Emily," he said. She looked at him. "When you get to Quantico," he said, "when you're standing in front of those students," he paused. "Say it the way he would have said it. Don't try to be something different to fill a different space. Just be exactly who you are, because who you are is exactly what they need." She looked at him for a long time. "How do you know what they need?" she said. "Because I watched you save a team of Navy SEALs," he said, "by being exactly who you are." She had no answer for that. He moved towards the door, favoring his left side in the careful way of someone managing pain without making a performance of it. He stopped in the doorway. "Rest," she told him. "5 more minutes," he said, and was gone. Emily stood in the supply room for a long time after that. She stood with her clipboard and her inventory and the rifle cleaning kit that Marcus had left on the shelf in the particular quiet of a room that had held in one afternoon more honesty than most rooms hold in a year. She thought about her either sitting with Colonel Hargrove at some point in the last year of his life, laying out a plan. She thought about him writing it down because he wrote everything down, meticulous as always, because preparation was respect for the future. She thought about him saying her name to a man he trusted and saying, "Eventually she'll be ready." Not if, eventually. The certainty of it hit her differently now than it would have a week ago. A week ago, she would have felt the weight of it as pressure, as expectation she hadn't asked for, as a destination that had been chosen for her. Now she felt it as something else. She felt it as faith. Her father had known her better than she had known herself, and he had made a plan that accounted not just for her capability, but for her fear. Not just for her talent, but for the time she would need to stop running from it. He had left a door open and trusted that she would eventually choose to walk through it. She was choosing, not because she had to, not because the mission had forced her hand, or the paperwork had been submitted, or the assessment scores had made the decision obvious. She was choosing because she was finally, after 9 years, not afraid of what was on the other side. At 17:30, Colonel Reese passed by the supply room and looked in and saw her still working through the inventory. "Dawson," he said. She looked up. "Your redesignation is confirmed," he said. "It'll be in orders by 0800 tomorrow." "Yes, sir," she said. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. It was not a question she had expected from him. He was not a man who asked that kind of question without meaning it. She gave it the consideration it deserved. "Like someone who just stopped carrying dead weight," she said. He tilted his head, slightly questioning. "For 9 years," she said. "I've been carrying the version of myself that was too afraid to be the version my father built. That's a lot of weight, heavier than the ammunition." She paused. "I put it down, or I'm putting it down. It doesn't happen all at once." Colonel Reese looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He started to move on, then stopped. "Tom used to say something," he said, "back at Quantico during training. He used to say the hardest shot you will ever take is not the one with the longest distance or the worst conditions or the most at stake." He paused, remembering. He said the hardest shot is the first one after you've been afraid, because you have to decide in that moment whether the fear is information or interference. And then you have to shoot anyway. Emily was still. "I think Colonel Reese said you took that shot, out on that ridge." She looked at the shelf. "I think," she said, "I've been taking it every day since." He nodded once. "Good," he said, "keep shooting." And he walked on. And Emily turned back to her inventory and worked through it with the careful, thorough attention she had always given it, not because she was hiding inside it anymore, but because the work was real and the work mattered, and she was the kind of person who finished what she started, which was something her father had made sure of right alongside everything else. Outside, the base was moving into evening. The generators hummed, the radio crackled, the sound of boots on gravel marked the changing of the watch. And inside the supply room, in the ordinary light of an ordinary evening, a woman who had spent 9 years learning to disappear was finally carefully fully learning to stay. The deployment ended 31 days later. Not with ceremony, not with a formal farewell or a unit gathering, or any of the rituals that people sometimes construct around endings to make them feel more complete. It ended the way most things ended, in a forward operating base in northern Iraq, with paperwork, with packing, with the particular kind of tiredness that accumulates not in a single day, but across months of sustained attention and controlled tension, and that only becomes fully visible when the thing requiring it finally stops. Emily packed her gear in the same methodical way she did everything, organized by weight, by frequency of use, by what needed to be accessible and what could go deep. She had packed this same bag 11 months ago in a room at Fort Bragg, and she was a different person than the one who had closed those buckles then, and she was aware of the difference, the way you're aware of a healed bone, not constantly, but when you move in a particular direction, when the weight settles in a particular way. The last thing she packed was her father's photograph. She had kept it in the same place for 11 months, propped against a small shelf at the head of her cot, angled, so that it was the first thing she saw in the morning and the last thing visible at night. It was not a formal photo. It was a snapshot taken at the range in Montana when she was 14, both of them squinting into afternoon sun, her father's hand on her shoulder, both of them holding the same posture of people who have just finished doing something well. Someone had taken it without either of them knowing. She had no idea who. She had found it in the box of his things after he died and had not let go of it since. She held it for a moment before sliding it into the front pocket of her bag. "Still there," Jake Carver said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "Still there," she said. He stepped into the room and leaned against the wall and watched her finish packing with the easy, comfortable presence of someone who had learned in 31 days that Emily Dawson did not require conversation to be accompanied, but would engage in it honestly if you were patient enough to wait. "What time is your transport?" he said. 0600, she said. "Mine's 0800. He was quiet for a moment. "We'll be stateside at different times. Different bases, different assignments." He looked at the floor. "I don't know when I'm going to see you again." Emily closed the last buckle on her bag. She turned and looked at him. Jake Carver had called her runner for 11 months. He had handed her ammunition cases and asked about magazine counts, and walked past her in hallways without fully registering her presence. The way you don't register furniture, you've been living around long enough. And then she had picked up a rifle and he had been on his back in the dirt, looking at the sky afterward, and the whole architecture of what he understood about her had collapsed and been rebuilt in the space of 12 minutes on a ridge. I was one of the best people she had known, she had decided in the past month. Not despite the fact that he'd failed to see her, but partly because of the way he had responded when he finally did. "You'll find me," she said. He looked up. "Quantico's not a secret location," she said. Something moved across his face relief, she thought, and something warmer than that. "When do you report?" he said. 3 weeks after I'm back," she said. Colonel Hargrove wanted to meet before the formal start date, talk through the program structure. What needs rebuilding, what I want to do differently, how to approach the parts my father developed. She paused. "There's a lot to absorb." "You'll absorb it," Jake said. She looked at him. "You don't know that," she said. "I watched you step into a sniper position you'd never use with a rifle you hadn't fired in the field under active enemy contact at 743 meters, he said. "And you put the round exactly where it needed to go." He held her gaze. "I know that." She picked up her bag. "That was different," she said. "No, it wasn't," he said. "Teaching is just another kind of precision. You're not shooting at a target, you're shooting at a person's understanding of something, and you have to know your subject well enough to know exactly where to put the round." He paused. "You know your subject better than anyone alive." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most coherent thing I've ever heard you say." Jake laughed. It was the real laugh, the full one, the one she had only heard twice before, and that sounded like somebody letting go of something heavy from a great height. "Don't tell the guys," he said. "I have a reputation." She picked up her bag. "Goodbye, Jake," she said. He straightened off the wall. "Goodbye, Emily," he said. She walked past him through the door, and he didn't follow, and she didn't look back, and neither of them needed to say anything more, because some things complete themselves without a formal ending. The transport landed at Fort Bragg at 14:23 hours on a Thursday in March. The flight had been long and largely silent. Military transport aircraft were not designed for comfort or conversation, and most of the people on board slept or stared at whatever middle distance their minds had settled on. Emily sat with her bag at her feet and her hands in her lap and thought about Quantico, which was 3 weeks away, and felt simultaneously very close and very large. She had spoken with Colonel Hargrove twice by phone during the final week of deployment. How was not what she expected. She had constructed from Ryan's description and her own memory of that brief funeral encounter an image of a man shaped by authority and precision, formal, careful, perhaps a little distant in the way that people who carry significant institutional weight sometimes become. What she found instead was a man who asked good questions and then went quiet, actually quiet. In the way that people who know how to listen go quiet, not filling the space after the answer with the next question, but sitting with the answer first. The first call had been introductory. He told her about the program structure. She listened. She asked 3 questions each of which he answered with the particular specificity of someone who had been thinking about these things for a long time. At the end of the first call, he said, "Your father described you in very specific terms." She had braced herself. "He said you were the most honest shooter he ever trained," Colonel Hargrove said. "He didn't mean technically. He meant that when you made a shot, you knew exactly why you made it. You never surprised yourself. You never got lucky and called it skill." He paused. He said that was the rarest quality, harder to teach than any technique. Emily had held the phone and not said anything for a moment. "He also said," Colonel Hargrove continued, "that you were stubborn enough to be wrong for a long time before you admitted it." Emily had exhaled. "That sounds like him," she said. "It did," Hargrove said, and she could hear the smile in it. "He said it like it was his favorite thing about you." The second call was more substantive. They talked for an hour about the wind reading component, specifically about what her father had taught, about how he had sequenced the lessons, about what he believed students needed to understand before they could begin to feel rather than calculate. Emily found herself talking with a fluency she hadn't expected, the words coming not from effort, but from the place where deeply learned things live, the place below conscious retrieval. At one point, she said something about the relationship between patience and accuracy, about how the tendency to rush a shot under pressure was not a technical failure but a psychological one, rooted in the mistaken belief that faster decisions were better ones. And Colonel Hargrove went very quiet. Then he said, "Say that again." She said it again. "Write that down," he said. "Exactly like that. That's the first lesson." She had written it down. She had written it in the same notebook she had been carrying for 11 months, the one she used for inventory notes and equipment observations, and the occasional lines she needed to remember and didn't trust to memory alone. She wrote it on the page directly after the last inventory count from the phobie, and looking at the juxtaposition ammunition numbers, then a lesson about patience. She felt the strange specific continuity of a life that had been moving in one direction all along, even when she was convinced it was standing still. Fort Bragg in March was cold and gray, in the way that southern cold is not the hard, clean cold of Montana, but the damp, seeping cold that finds the gaps in your clothing and settles there. Emily processed through the administrative return with the efficiency of someone who had done it before and wanted to do it quickly, signed in what needed signing, turned in what needed returning, collected what needed collecting. She was on her way to the temporary housing assignment when she heard her name. She turned. Sergeant First Class Linda Okafor was standing 20 meters away in civilian clothes with the expression of someone who has gone slightly out of their way to be in a specific place at a specific time. "You weren't on the manifest I was given," Emily said. "I wasn't on the manifest because I wasn't supposed to be here," Linda said. "I'm on leave. I drove 4 hours." Emily looked at her. "Why?" she said. Linda took a breath. "Because I needed to tell you something in person," she said. "And I needed to do it before Quantico, before the program, before all of it becomes official and the moment passes." They stood in the cold air and Emily waited. "I called my daughter," Linda said, "the week after the assessment, after our conversation in the supply room." She paused. "We talked for 2 hours. I told her about you, about what I'd seen, what I'd missed, what I'd told her about being realistic." She stopped. Her jaw was tight with the effort of saying something that mattered more than it was comfortable to say. I told her I'd been wrong, that being realistic is not the same thing as being honest about your capability, that I'd given her fear and called it wisdom. Emily was very still. She's reapplying, Linda said, to a different program than she was considering, a harder one she'd taken herself off the list for because I told her to think carefully. She looked at Emily directly. She took herself off the list because of me, and now she's putting herself back. The words sat in the cold air between them. I needed you to know that, Linda said. What you did not just on the ridge, not just the assessment, but showing up every day for 11 months and doing the work even when it wasn't the right work for you. Even that, she stopped. It meant something. It means something. Emily looked at her. How old is she? Emily said. 21, Linda said. Emily thought about 21. She thought about herself at 21, 2 years after her father's death, making the decision to enlist as support. Closing a door she told herself she was only setting aside temporarily and then walked away from for 9 years. Tell her, Emily said, that the hardest shot is not the longest one. It's the first one after you've been afraid. She paused. Tell her to shoot anyway. Linda looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded once and her eyes were bright, and she turned and walked back toward the parking lot without another word because she was the kind of woman who said what she needed to say and didn't require an epilogue. Emily watched her go. Then she picked up her bag and went to find her housing assignment. 3 weeks later, she drove to Quantico. She had done the drive in her father's truck, the one she had kept in storage for 9 years, starting it periodically to keep the engine viable, paying the storage fees without examining too closely why she couldn't make herself sell it. It was a 2003 Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles and a crack in the dashboard that her father had always meant to fix and never had, and it smelled even now, faintly of gun oil and the particular cedar of the closet at the Montana house where he kept his equipment. She drove with the windows up and the radio off and thought about what she was driving toward. Colonel Hargrove met her at the entrance of the Precision Marksmanship Training Facility. I was 63 years old, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the steady hands of a man who had spent decades teaching other people to be still. He looked at her for a moment when she got out of the truck with the specific attention of someone who is looking for something they expected to find and is confirming its presence. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. You look like him, he said. People say that, she said. Around the eyes, he said, the way you see things. He held her gaze for a moment. He told me once that the best shooters don't just look at a target. They look at everything between themselves and the target. They see the whole space, every variable, every possibility. He paused. I've been watching you since you got out of the truck. You've looked at this building 6 different ways in 45 seconds. Emily said nothing. That's what I mean, he said, and turned and walked toward the entrance. She followed. The first thing he showed her was the classroom where her father had taught for 11 years. It was a plain functional room, tables and chairs arranged in a configuration designed to keep the students oriented toward the front, without the artificial formality of a lecture hall, a whiteboard, equipment displays along one wall, a photograph she hadn't expected mounted near the door, not prominently but positioned where you'd see it on the way in or out. Her father at a firing line, early 50s, she thought, from the silver at his temples. He was standing behind a student, one hand on the student's shoulder, his eyes on the downrange target with an expression she recognized, not from photographs but from memory. The expression of a man who was absolutely, completely, contentedly in the right place. She stood in front of it for a long time. Colonel Hargrove let her. Then he said quietly, he loved this room. I know, she said. I used to come in early, Hargrove said. Before the students arrived, I'd find him sitting at the front, just sitting. I asked him once what he was doing. He said he was thinking about what each student needed that day. What specific thing for that specific person would move them from where they were to where they needed to go? He paused. He said teaching was just personalized precision. Know your subject, know your student, find the exact point of connection. Emily looked at the photograph. That's what I'm going to try to do, she said. I know, Hargrove said. That's why you're here. I gave her the rest of the day to walk the facility, to sit in the classroom, to spend time at the range with no expectation of performance, just presence, just orientation. She spent 2 hours at the firing line with her own rifle, not running drills, not setting targets, just shooting the way she had sometimes shot as a teenager when her father let her go to the range alone, finding her own pace, listening to the relationship between herself and the weapon without anyone else's requirements imposed on it. She thought about what she would teach. Not the technical elements, those were clear. She had been carrying them for 20 years. She thought about the order of things, about what a student needed to understand first, about the lessons she had written in her notebook on the transport home. Patience is not the absence of urgency. It is the discipline to let the moment be exactly what it is before you ask it to be something else. She thought about a 14-year-old girl on a range in Montana shifting position after 2 hours because her leg had cramped, and the silence from the man behind her that had been the sharpest instruction she ever received. She would teach the silence, the patience, the understanding that the moment does not care whether you are ready, only whether you know. She would teach it the way he had taught her, not by lecturing about it, but by building the conditions in which a student discovers it for themselves. Because knowledge that arrives through discovery lives differently in the body than knowledge that is handed over. Her father had known that. He had engineered her education around it, years of carefully designed situations that were never quite what they seemed, always asking her to find something she didn't know she was looking for. She was going to do the same. On the last evening before the program formally began, Emily sat in the classroom alone. She had turned off most of the lights. She sat at the front in the chair that had been her father's, and she looked at the empty seats and thought about who would sit in them tomorrow. Young soldiers, experienced operators, people who could already shoot and who had come here to learn to shoot better, to understand something they currently did only by instinct or technique, to have language built around something that was so far only sensation. She was going to give them that language. She was going to teach them to read wind the way other people read words. She was going to stand in this room and say the things her father had said, and the things she had added to his foundation in the years since, and the things she had learned in 11 months of carrying ammunition and watching elite operators prepare for combat, and understanding in a way she could not have understood from a firing line alone what it actually cost when precision failed. She knew that cost now. She had felt it on a ridge in the moment between Ryan going down and her picking up the rifle, in the 3 seconds when she understood what not acting would mean. That knowledge was part of what she would bring into this room. She looked at the photograph of her father by the door. "I'm here," she said quietly. Not to the room, not to the empty chairs, to him. She sat with the silence for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry it took so long." The silence held. And then, not as a supernatural thing, not as anything that required belief, she felt it. The same thing she had felt on the ridge when she picked up the rifle and the world went quiet. The same settling of everything into alignment. The feeling of a person who has been carrying weight in the wrong position, finally shifting it to the right one, and understanding in their bones the difference. She was not afraid. She was not performing courage. She was not managing the absence of confidence. She was not falling back on discipline to carry her through doubt. She was simply entirely, completely in the right place. The program began the next morning at 0600. 14 students filed into the classroom. They were varied in rank and experience, in the specific confidence or uncertainty they carried into the room. Some had deployed multiple times. Some were newer. All of them had been selected because someone in their command structure had looked at their record and decided they had what it took to be better, more precise, more reliable under conditions that didn't tolerate error. Emily stood at the front of the room. She looked at them. They looked at her. She saw it happen, the recalibration. The moment when a room full of people expecting one thing encountered something else. She was not what they had imagined. She was not the person their assumptions had constructed from the designation on the course roster. She was a woman, and she was younger than some of them, and she was standing at the front of the room with the quiet, settled authority of someone who had nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to perform. She let them look. She waited. She gave them exactly the time they needed to arrive at the present moment. And then she said, "My father built this program. His name was Master Sergeant Thomas Dawson, and he taught here for 11 years. And he was the finest precision instructor the Marine Corps ever produced." She paused. "I am not him. I am what he built. And what he built is what you're going to spend the next 8 weeks learning. She looked across the room at each of them in turn, steadily without hurry. The first thing you need to understand is that everything you think you know about what makes a great shooter is probably correct and almost certainly incomplete. We are going to find the gaps. We are going to fill them. And we are going to do it by being more honest about what we don't know than we are comfortable being. The room was absolutely still. The second thing you need to understand, she said, is that I will not ask you to do anything I cannot do. I will not teach you anything I do not know. And I will not accept from any of you less than the most accurate account of your own capability that you can give. She paused, because accuracy is not just about where the round goes. It starts here in how clearly you see yourself. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. They were leaning forward. Every single one of them, exactly the way her father had said they would. She had not risen to this moment. She had fallen to the level of everything Thomas Dawson had prepared her for every morning on the range, every correction, every hour of patience he had built into her hands and her mind with the care and precision of a man who was making something he intended to last. And it had lasted. Through 9 years of grief and hiding, and the long, quiet discipline of being invisible. Through 11 months of carrying other people's ammunition. Through 12 minutes on a ridge in northern Iraq when everything her father had ever taught her rose up in her hands and made itself undeniable. Through every moment she had believed she was only the person standing behind the people who mattered. She had been the person who mattered. She had always been. She had simply been waiting for herself to know it. Sergeant Emily Dawson looked at her students and she began.